Good afternoon, everybody. At least good afternoon in Buenos Aires. I don't know, Dr. Salem, which part of the day is where you are. Thank you for joining us and welcome in the name of the institutions organizing this meeting, Fundación Foro del Sur, the ASPA Institute, and the sponsor, who is the interpreter, Digital. As you know, this meeting is organized just to hear the Professor Salem speaking about a topic and a region which are always on the news, and which is about the dynamics of conflict and cooperation in a changing Middle East. I would like now to give the floor to Hodor Halil, who is going to be the moderator of this meeting, who will introduce Dr. Salem. Thank you very much. Hodor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Shadows, for your kind words and introduction. It is a pleasure to have you all with us today, all the way from Argentina, passing through the United States in Washington, where President Salem is sitting today, but also many other countries throughout the South American region, but also the Middle East. So good afternoon to some and good night to some others like myself sitting in Cairo today. So I want to welcome everyone to today's event, which has been titled the Dynamics of Conflict and Cooperation in the Middle East. I want to also extend my gratitude to Fundación Foro del Sur and ASPA Institute and the Digital Interpreter for organizing this event and supporting it. Before introducing our guest speaker today, I would like to invite you to follow the organizing and sponsoring institutions on social media to keep up to date about future events and subscribe to their weekly bulletins to receive the latest news. Now, it is my privilege to introduce the guest for today, which is Paul Salem, President of the Middle East Institute, who, besides founding and presiding many think tanks throughout the world, and particularly in Lebanon, he is a prolific writer whose work has been published ever since the early 1990s. But he's also an innovative music composer who mixes Arabic and Brazilian jazz. So it is a true example of this relation between South America or Latin America in general and the Middle East. For those unfamiliar with the Middle East Institute, it is the oldest Washington-based think tank dedicated solely to the study of the Middle East. And since 2020, through its publications, since 2020, its publications are made available in Spanish by the Digital Interpreter. So I invite everyone to visit it. Today's event is expected to last about 1 hour, and it is divided in two parts. The first, I will be posing some leading questions to our guest speaker, and then the floor will be open to the audience and their questions. So for the sake of order and sanity, attendees will remain muted through the session and are encouraged to submit questions directly to the moderator or through the Q&A box. Please feel free to share your name, institutional affiliation, and location. So now, Mr. Paul Salem, welcome. It is a great pleasure to have you with us, and as I understand, it is American audience.
Thank you, Hodor, and thank you, Professor Lados, and thank you for the wonderful institutions hosting this event. I hope I can come visit Buenos Aires soon. As I was mentioning before, I am Lebanese, but my great-grandfather emigrated to Argentina back before World War I. and lived, worked, and died in Buenos Aires. So I should go back and visit at some point. It's a great pleasure, great honor to be with you today. As you say, I preside over the Middle East Institute. We have dozens of scholars working on all kinds of issues in the Middle East. And I hope I can be helpful in our conversations today, and put it over to you for the questions that you would like to pose to guide our discussion.
Thank you for your kind words, and we will be more than happy to have you in Buenos Aires anytime soon. To start our discussion, I would like to address the foreign influence in the region. So the first question is, since the end of World War II, Washington and Moscow have been the most influential foreign actors in the region. As the Cold War began to warm up, the USA promoted the Central Treaty Organization to contain the Soviet Union, and the latter is suspected of having induced the 1967 Israeli Arab War. More recently, and under different circumstances, Washington and Moscow found themselves at odds in Libya, Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. Most importantly, both global powers carried much of the responsibility for global security. So for the same reason, it is worth asking, how is the US-Russian competition affecting regional dynamics?
Thank you, Khudar, for that question. To put it a bit in historical context, because it's interesting, historically, before World War I, Turkey was the great power in the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire. Between World War I and World War II, it was the British and the French who were the great powers in the Middle East. And as you say, after World War II, it was the US and the Soviet Union until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. When you look at the last 30 years, there was a period of 15 years between 1990 and 2015, essentially, so 25 years, when the US really was dominant as a foreign power. Russia was on the back foot, was reconstituting itself, and the US had a couple of decades where it was really dominant. This maybe led to some overreach, what you would call hubris, after the attacks of 9/11, where the US launched wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, thinking that it could just change the region like it did in World War II in Europe and in Japan. The return of Russia was signaled by its return to Syria in 2015, which is only 6 years ago now, but it is a significant return. When you look at the picture of the Middle East today, the US remains the strongest external power. Russia is a resurgent power, but with very narrow presence. You see it certainly in Syria. It has some presence in Libya and a few places here and there, but it is not a major presence. It is not something that worries the United States very much, because they don't see Russia as a rising power, as a major competitor in the next decades. The US focus is almost entirely on China. And China is increasingly having a major presence in the Middle East. Most of that is commercial or economic. Certainly, they're the major consumer of energy and oil. It used to be the United States, it's now China. They are gaining leads in infrastructure, in technology, in 5G, telecom issues. So they are rising as an economic power. And that is something that is of great concern to the United States. China is not yet challenging the United States in the Middle East in the geopolitical sense, mainly because the arrangement is convenient to China. The US Navy ensures the free flow of oil to world markets. In effect, the US Navy is ensuring that oil from the Persian Gulf gets to China. That's effectively what's happening. And the Chinese get that protection for free, so they're happy with it. The US is not going to give it up, and the Chinese are not going to challenge it anytime soon. The Chinese also are not interested, unlike the Russians, in getting involved in disputes, political issues, regional problems, domestic problems. They want to stay away from contentious or conflictual issues, and they want to maintain business with everybody. That does include Iran. If they can, it includes Saudi Arabia, it includes Africa, and so on. What I'll conclude by saying is, your question is about the great or the external powers, but in the last 100 years, and certainly in the last 50 years, the regional powers have become very powerful. Iran is the obvious example. Iran is the most powerful player in Syria, the most powerful player in Lebanon, most powerful in Iraq, most powerful in Yemen, more powerful than any of the great powers. Turkey has tried to play that role, has not succeeded very well. Yes, they do have some influence. They have a presence in northwest Syria, some influence and presence in Libya, some presence in Iraq. They had great ambitions, but those ambitions have not been greatly realized. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE also have a lot of commercial power, even though not a lot of military power. So, and Israel, of course, is a very powerful player. So unlike 50 years ago or 60 years ago, the states of the region have a lot of influence and determine a lot of what goes on in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you for your insightful comments. Certainly, the region has changed throughout the last few decades, and especially after the big conflicts that our world has seen. Now, since the 1950s, when nuclear energy has proliferated throughout the region, Israel, Iran, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates have all acquired some form of nuclear technology. Thus, the proliferation of nuclear weapons is a well-founded preoccupation, and the ongoing negotiations in Vienna to restore the joint plan of comprehensive action are meant to address this issue. But is the return of the JCPOA enough to limit the use of nuclear programs or the development of nuclear weapons? If not, what else is needed?
You correctly, identify that the risk of the proliferation of nuclear weapons remains a very, very major one. Of course, Israel has nuclear weapons, but nobody else currently has nuclear weapons. Libya had a program that was stopped. Iraq at one point had elements of a program and stopped. Syria might have had a bit of a program and stopped. Obviously, now Iran has been the main issue for the last 15 years. They certainly currently, you would say, have breakout capacity. They know how to do it. They could do it if they wanted to. That puts them in a bit similar to the Germans or the Japanese or others who have the know-how and capacity to do it if they want to, but so far have chosen not to go in that direction. The region is looking at the situation in Iran very closely. It is very much the case that if Iran moves towards a nuclear weapon, we will likely have an immediate reaction, particularly from Turkey and Saudi Arabia, maybe Egypt, in the direction of trying to acquire nuclear weapons. I think at the moment we're not in that situation. The JCPOA is an instrument that's supposed to buy time and resolve that issue at least for a number of years. I've been in touch on and off with the American negotiators at least, that are set to meet with their Iranian counterparts. Robert Malley is the main negotiator from the US side. And I must say, so far, he is not optimistic. They still might be able to get a deal, or they might get part of a deal. If there is a deal, I think that will at least temporarily reassure some of the Arab countries and Turkey that they don't need to go directly towards any nuclear weaponized program. But it does not resolve the issue in the long term. It's also true that given the risks of climate change and the need to reduce the carbon footprint, the use of civilian nuclear energy is going to be more widespread in the region, not less. And countries and companies and economies will acquire the knowledge. This is a problem, that is worldwide, because nuclear energy is going to have to be part of the non-carbon energy mix for the 21st century. And how to maintain and build civilian nuclear capacity without going towards nuclear weaponization will remain a global risk. I would say, yes, Iran and the Middle East is a local risk, but you still have massive arsenals in the US and Russia. China is speeding up its nuclear weapons program. So the world is still very much at risk from nuclear weapons, and that needs to be addressed globally. In the region, I think if relations between the Arab countries and Israel move forward, if there is progress with the Iranians, what really needs to be done is to put on the table what has been put on the table many times, a treaty or an agreement for a Middle East free of nuclear weapons. But that would have to include Israel, and Israel would have to commit to dismantling its nuclear weapons program, because Israel's program is partly why Iran continues to be worried and continues to think about a nuclear program for itself, because Israel has nuclear weapons.
Thank you for your response, and obviously any kind of regional-wide agreement to ban nuclear weapons in the region would start with the normalization of relations also, or would countries would have to establish some kind of a venue for dialogue. And in that sense, it is that I will pose the next question, which is the establishment of normal relations among neighbors in the region is always welcome, and it is understood to promote regional stability and security in this case, as we were talking about in the previous question. Now, however, reactions were mixed to the normalization of relations with Israel through the Abraham Accords, and also to the possible return of Syria to the League of Arab States. Thus, my question is, what regional cleavages and dynamics do the manifested differing opinions reflect?
Well, on the Abraham Accords, there's no doubt that the main issue related to the Palestinians. As you well know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been ongoing since the 1940s, and it has gotten, I would say, worse, not better, since the Camp David peace agreements between Israel and Egypt back in 1979. Israel embarked on a vigorous project of building settlements on the West Bank and carving up the West Bank in ways that, they violate international law, they violate all kinds of agreements and laws, but they also continue to expropriate the land of Palestinians on the West Bank. And the geography of the settlements and the highways and the walls really make the possibility of a two-state solution very, very difficult and very, very remote, and extends the Israeli occupation, particularly of the West Bank, indefinitely into the 21st century. All of the international community has said there should be a peace process, there should be some progress towards two-state solution, there has to be some dismantling of illegal settlements. The Arab position traditionally had been that the Arab countries would normalize with Israel only if and after the Israelis and the Palestinians came to some satisfactory agreement and a two-state solution. So the Abraham Accords by the UAE, Bahrain, and then Sudan and Morocco overstepped that original Arab position and said, we're going to go ahead and normalize anyway. They did get, at least from the Netanyahu government, a pledge to suspend a plan that they were going to put into effect, which was to annex the settlements on the West Bank, annex them formally to Israel. That was the concession they got. So that's why there was controversy over the Abraham Accords. But the Abraham Accords are proceeding. They are impacting the relations between the countries that are now in agreement. They have effects on trade, investment, technology, as well as on defense, security, intelligence, many areas of that type. The issue of reaching out to the Assad regime is different. Maybe it's similar in one sense, that the Assad regime is considered, obviously, by the international community, by many people in the Middle East, as a very dangerous, very genocidal, I don't know what word you want to say, but it's been an extremely, extremely brutal regime with its own people, regardless of what you think of the opposition or some groups in the opposition. But the government itself, with its own people, no doubt has been extremely, extremely, extremely brutal. So there is kind of a resistance among some quarters to a simple normalization with the Assad regime after all the crimes were committed. But again, I think the sense of most of the Arab states is that Assad is here to stay. He is the head of the Syrian government and the Syrian state, such as it is. That's life. We have to move on. We have to rebuild relations with the Syrian state, with the Syrian economy, with the Syrian people. And that is the direction that is going into. Thanks.
Thank you for your views. And definitely there are many things that need to be addressed in the region for relations to become normal among all countries in the region. Now, something that caught my attention back in 2019, and I'm pretty sure many of the audience were the protests in Lebanon and Iraq. By the end of 2019, and for different reasons, social movements in Iraq and Lebanon took to the streets to demand political and economic reforms. Protesters in both countries were undeterred by state security forces and were finally demobilized by movement restrictions imposed due to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, today, both countries continue to face difficulties as political forces in Iraq, for example, challenge electoral results, and a political stalemate in Lebanon inhibits any kind of reform. Since both countries are at the crossroads of regional tensions, what developments may contribute to stability in each country?
Well, Khadr, you're very right to point to the mood of protest that was there 2018, 2019. You mentioned Iraq and Lebanon. Sudan had a revolution or major protest that led actually to a democratic transition until a few weeks ago. Sadly, when the military took over again, but Sudan went through a period. Algeria had major protests as well. So yes, there was a lot of that. The conditions of 2020 and 2021 impacted Iraq and Lebanon, as well as other countries in the region, in the sense that they dampened, because of the pandemic, they dampened the ability to protest in large numbers. People were more afraid, staying at home. It also increased the role of central governments because they were managing the pandemic, so they became more intrusive, more powerful, I would say, and people became more concerned with the life and their life issues, income, health, at least for the time being. I think if and when the pandemic really begins to lift, and it could take 1 or 2 years still, I think we will see a deficit a deficit of protest, meaning I think we will see a surge of protest throughout the region after the pandemic lifts, but not immediately. Iraq and Lebanon are both very interesting cases, as you say. Iraq just had elections. The results are interesting. One important result is that the militias, many of them backed by Iran, did very, very poorly in the elections in Iraq. And that's a very important signal that people were rejecting militia rule or that style of politics. They did very, very poorly. Some of the opposition, civil society, young people movement boycotted the elections because there was so much violence and there was a distrust of the process. But those groups that did participate had some results. They didn't do great, but they have a presence now in parliament that you could consider that a beginning, consider that a start. So that's hopeful. But Iraq is beset by a large number of challenges, most of which relate to a power sharing system which has entrenched a political elite which is extremely corrupt, which has siphoned off the oil resources of this rich country into private pockets or into militia pockets. And really, Iraq, sadly, is not moving forward in the way that it could, given that it has so many natural resources and such a capable citizenship and pretty well educated. So the road will continue to be challenging for Iraq. Also, Iraq suffers from external competition between Iran on one side and the United States on the other that often creates tension and instability. But Iraq is doing much better than Lebanon, as you mentioned. Lebanon is in a much worse situation. Its economy has completely collapsed in the last 2 years in a way that's almost unprecedented anywhere else around the world, much more than the Argentinian crisis years ago, as deep, if not more, than the Venezuelan crisis, although levels of hunger have not reached those levels. But Lebanon, which was once a fairly middle income country, is now having poverty rates of about 80% and hunger rates or food insecurity rates of about 25 to 30%, which is really unprecedented. There is not much positive movement in Lebanon. A government has been formed, but Hezbollah continues to block any effective meeting of the government until, and they have a condition, until the government fires the judge who is investigating that horrific port blast that occurred in August of last year, the biggest peacetime blast anywhere in the world that was probably linked to or had something to do with Hezbollah's presence in the port, and they don't want that exposed. So I'm very pessimistic about Lebanon, unfortunately.
Indeed, the Lebanese crisis caught the attention of Argentinians in particular, and I'm pretty sure of many other Venezuelans. And we looked at what was going on in Lebanon since 2019 because we noticed a lot of similarities. From the demands of political and economic reforms, but even to the extreme of the chants that were popular on the streets, many of those were very similar to the ones that were sung back in 2001 in Argentina. Now, when one or much of or a lot of analysis that has been done on the region, on conflict in particular, took the identity politics approach, and it became a dominant feature in conflict analysis. And this started to pit against each other, Arabs and Jews, Christians and Muslims, Arabs and Kurds, Sunnis and Shias, and new perspectives and narratives about these conflicts came to the fore and became very popular, I would say. And they had many strong arguments also. Now, since much of our conversation has revolved around geopolitics, what conflicts do you think are best served by a combination of a geopolitical approach with an identity politics?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Again, to put it in historical perspective, identity politics really was linked to the entry of ideas of nationalism, citizenship, people's power, into the Middle East, and that entered in the 19th century mainly from Europe, the idea that the people have the right to govern, whereas previously people were subjects to a state, to the Ottoman Sultan or the Ottoman system or something else. The ideas of nationalism and citizenship raised the question, if the people are to govern, and if they have the sovereignty, then who are the people, right? How do you define the people? And that's where questions of linguistic identity, racial identity, geographic identity began to compete. And if you look historically, the first major waves of identity politics were very broad. Arab nationalism was a very big, broad identity in 1917, 1918. The French and the British betrayed their promises to the Arab Revolt, which was supposed to create an Arab state, at least in the eastern part of the Middle East, and broke the Levant into separate states. So the question of who are the people remains a very complex and a very relevant one. Sometimes the answer is given by identity. The Kurds, identify as Kurds and that they should have a Kurdish state. But there's also national identities that have endured. Some of them are old identities, like the Egyptian identity, the Moroccan identity, the Tunisian identity. These are real identities. Some are more new. Lebanese identity, despite the divisions, people identify as Lebanese, even though they disagree over other things. In a broader scope, if you look at post-World War II, during the Cold War, it was not identity politics which was strongest. It was ideological politics. It was the Communist Party, the Socialist parties, which mobilized populations in Iraq or in Syria and so on. And because it was fueled by the Cold War, the ideologies of the Cold War between left and right, and the financing and support of groups either by Moscow or the United States, you find that the divisions there were not identity politics, but were ideological politics. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I would say in the Middle East, a number of things that happened at the same time. But the collapse of the Soviet Union sort of ended the ideological period because communist and leftist movements lost their impact. And at the same time, around the late 70s to the late 80s, you have the rise of Iran, a very powerful state which took an Islamic identity and took a Shiite identity. And you have in Saudi Arabia a movement towards more extreme Islamization and Sunnification, if you can use the term. And Iran and Saudi Arabia, like the Soviet Union and the US before, poured billions of dollars into mobilizing people along these lines. Because if you also remember, oil prices by 79 became very high, and both Iran and Saudi Arabia had a lot of money. So that helped fuel a lot of identity politics. But you also see identity politics around the world. I mean, you see it in the US, you see it in Europe. So it's also a global phenomenon. But I would say that it's not really a useful way to look at the problems of these countries and how to resolve them. Because in most of the countries, the problem really is generated by poor governance, by social and economic and basic political and civic needs that are not met by the governments. So it's a basic, simple governance problem that ends up being taken advantage of either by identity politics or by Islamist politics, which is not technically identity politics. That's more sort of ideological politics. But I would say the solutions to problems in the Middle East are not through more identity politics, but are through better governance, better representation of the people, regardless of exactly how you define them and who they are.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Very insightful. It is true that when we do analyze, we need to take into consideration different perspectives, and as you pointed out, some are more useful than others, depending on the scenario that we're looking at and the countries that are involved and their history as well. Now I have come to the end of my part, and this is where we turn over the table and give the opportunity to the audience to share some of their concerns and questions to you, and also give you the opportunity to interact with them, and also to get to know them a little bit. No, I understand. I will repeat this. It is a little bit of a new audience for you, in the sense that it is the first time that you're able to engage with a South American and a Latin American audience, not a Spanish audience. You have already spoken in Spain, but this truly is a unique or a first time. So I have selected a few questions that I have arrived while we were having this very interesting conversation. And since we have had a very important date just recently for Israel and Palestine, they will take different interpretations about this date. One called it the independence of Israel, while the other camp will call it the Nakba. I will give priority to the question related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And basically, the question comes from Susana Brauner. She's a professor at the University of 3 de Febrero in Argentina. And she's asking, how do you see the role of Hamas within the Palestinian camp, and not only within the Palestinian camp, but also within the larger Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Thank you. Yeah, well, Hamas is well entrenched in the Gaza Strip. It is part of a broader movement of Islamist political parties linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, which originally was in Egypt, but has been driven out of Egypt or underground in Egypt by the government of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, so they're no longer active there, but they're present in many Arab countries. Hamas is one of the examples of that. Hamas, there's a number of things to say about them. They themselves are not eager to hold elections in Gaza. They are worried about their own popularity. So they have political issues inside Gaza itself. They are also repressive, and they are also somewhat violent and somewhat extremist in the way they manage Gaza itself. Of course, them and Gaza are in a very difficult situation. They are under siege by both from the Israeli and the Egyptian side. You have about 2 million people effectively under siege for many, many years, living in extreme poverty. So it's a very, very desperate socioeconomic and humanitarian situation. Obviously, with COVID, it just got even worse. Vis-a-vis Israel, Hamas obviously rejects negotiations with Israel, rejects a peaceful settlement with Israel, and favors, at least in theory or in principle, an armed struggle, the continuation of the armed struggle with Israel. Unfortunately, that has played into, on the Israeli right-wing side, it gives them a good, let's say, argument to say, look, if one of the major Palestinian groups that occupies half of, or a big part of the Palestinian territory refuses to recognize us or to have talks with us, how do you expect us to have peace negotiations? Who speaks on behalf of the Palestinians? So it kind of suits, in a way, some of the Israeli, who don't really want to go to real negotiations and have to talk about a two-state solution. On the West Bank, because you have to think of them together, Abu Mazen, the current president, who is from the Fatah movement, the traditional Fatah movement and the PLO, very old, he's been there forever. He doesn't want elections either, and he's been putting them off again and again, partly because he's clinging to power, but partly because Fatah is worried that if they do hold elections in the West Bank, Hamas might do quite well. And so they keep putting elections off. Hamas does not seem to be in a mood to change its approach. I think it sees that Fatah and Abu Mazen and that whole attempt to negotiate with the Israelis has gone nowhere. These Palestinians really haven't gotten anything for it. So they say, see, we told you so, negotiating with the Israelis doesn't get us anything, so let's remain in this camp. But obviously many Palestinians say, well, carrying arms and lobbing missiles into Israel doesn't do any good either. And that certainly hasn't made life better for the Palestinians. In public opinion polls, you'll find that Palestinians obviously are very depressed. They do not believe neither in an armed struggle nor in the real prospect for a peaceful negotiated solution. They don't think that's going to happen. Many of them just want to leave and go somewhere else. It's a very, very depressing situation. Question is, if the Abraham Accords, will they change anything? Will they make at least life economically better for people on the West Bank? But even yesterday, I was talking with some Palestinian friends and who also have friends in the UAE. And as when the UAE people get visas to visit Israel, they are allowed to visit Israel, but they are not allowed to visit the West Bank, which is very sad and very troubling. So those are some thoughts.
Thank you for your comments. Obviously, the situation in Palestine is complicated. Now, I will take you to another complicated scenario, but one that you know very well, which is Lebanon. We have a question from Veronica Soto from Iteso, Mexico. And she's working on researching Lebanon, and she wants to know about the prospects for election next year, if there are going to be or not, what are the possible scenarios, and what impact those parliamentary elections may have on the election of a future president.
Very good question. Right now, it's impossible to predict. I would say it's a 50-50 chance that elections will happen or elections will not happen. There are some politicians, even in Lebanon, who want to hold elections. But I think Hezbollah, which is the dominant player, as well as their Christian allies, which includes the president and his son-in-law, Gibran Bassil, are very worried that if they hold elections, those Christian allies will lose a lot of seats, and Hezbollah therefore will lose its main Christian alliance, its main Christian cover. It doesn't have any allies really in the Sunni community, so it would be more politically exposed. For that reason, it's quite possible that they will push to not have elections. That scenario has happened many times before, as you know. That scenario would be that the parliament would meet and would say, look, the conditions in the country are too unstable for whatever reason. It's possible that Hezbollah even could make, a few clashes here and there to make it look difficult and say, look, it's not safe to hold elections. We're going to postpone them for a year or two. The parliament would prolong its own mandate. The parliament can also, if it wants to, prolong the mandate of the president, and that's how it would be done. I think that would be met by a strong reaction from the West, might include more sanctions on Lebanon and Lebanese politicians, but frankly, Hezbollah doesn't really care if the West puts more sanctions or not. They're part of an Iranian alliance, and they're happy not to be engaged with the Americans. So that is a very viable scenario. If elections do take place, and as I said, maybe it's a 50% chance that they do take place, the expectations are something as follows. I think the main shift in results will be mainly in the Christian electoral districts. It will not be super dramatic, but I think the party of the president and his son-in-law will lose a fair number of seats, and those seats will be taken by some traditional other Christian parties and by some of the new groups that arose during the revolution or revolt that started 2 years ago. So there will be some change if there are elections in the Christian districts. In the other districts, which is mainly, if you want to say, the south and the Bekaa, a lot of the Shiite district, Hezbollah controls very, very strongly. There is a rising discontent in the Shiite community. It's hard to measure exactly how much, but there are a lot of people, 25, 30, 40% in the Shiite communities who really don't, want to go along with the Hezbollah and Amal pathway. But Hezbollah does not allow that to be translated into anything actual. And a number of people have been killed who have dared to challenge Hezbollah on its own Shiite home turf. In the Sunni community, it's really a competition between different billionaires, but not much fundamental change. So elections, if they do happen, would be a little bit significant, not huge, but given that the president's term, if it's not extended, ends in the fall of 2022, the question of who will be elected president will be a very interesting one. And if Hezbollah doesn't have an automatic majority in parliament, it will not be able to impose the next president. But the next president would have to be kind of a compromise candidate between the various parties. Right now, I would say the most likely candidate could be the head of the army, General Joseph Aoun. He's seen as, has good relations with many parties. He has very good also credibility internationally. Currently, he's somebody who might be the next president.
Thank you for the analysis, and it is not a surprise that the General Aoun will be present himself as a potential candidate, given the recent history of Lebanon and all the presidents actually coming out of the armed forces to take on the presidency ever since the late 1990s. Now, I have a question here that addresses one point that you addressed just by passing, and I think it deserves a little bit more of analysis. This question is coming from Rami Yaqub. He's the executive director from of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, and he wants to. He's saying, or his question says, considering the latest developments in Sudan regarding the deal struck between the Prime Minister Hamdok and the General Burhan, many global North countries or global countries in the North didn't take well this decision, and social mobilization also reflected that uneasiness when it comes to this deal being struck between the Prime Minister and the General. And his question is, how will Middle East regional powers react to this deal, and do they endorse it? And if so, why?
Well, Rami, thank you for the question. And let me say, I don't feel that I'm expert enough on the Sudanese situation to really give the proper answer. And when I don't feel that I know enough, I'd rather, leave it to people who follow that country much better than I do. So I really haven't been following it as closely as I can, given all the many things I'm trying to keep up with. But so I apologize, because I wish I had better and more up-to-date information, I would have been happy to share it with you. But I'm sure there's some people in our institute who follow it closely, and I think we've had people writing about it, and perhaps that would be the way to go. So my apologies. Thanks, Rami.
Indeed, the Middle East Institute has published many articles about it, and hopefully they'll be available in Spanish soon as well. Another topic that you addressed, it was the Kurdish issue, and we have a question from Esteban Sanchez from Costa Rica, and he's wondering, or he wants to know how or what possibilities do you see about the creation of a Kurdish state nation in any time, in the short time specifically, given the instability that the region is going through? Is this instability helpful or is it hurtful for the Kurdish cause?
Well, obviously, I mean, the Kurdish people, the Kurdish nation was the people that was most betrayed and most ignored in the Paris talks after World War I. They were really, I forget what their population or how many millions they were then. There are many more millions now, but they ended up without any nation of their own, which is a crime and a tragedy. And they are divided between the states of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. There was for a little while hopes among the Iraqi Kurds that maybe they could have a state of their own. But I visit the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq frequently. I haven't been since COVID, but I've visited frequently since then. I think they recognize even there it's not a realistic option anytime in a realistic future, largely because they would be landlocked. They would have no access to any sea or seaway, and they would have hostile powers around them. And also the US has not encouraged them to do that, so they would not have US support or international support. Their ambition has been, and they've somewhat succeeded in that, at least, to have a very autonomous, self-governed Kurdish region in Iraq. And that's been something of a model. And it's something that has raised aspirations, certainly in Syria, and a little bit in Iraq, in Turkey. In Iraq itself, the Kurdish regional government, yes, has been autonomous, has been very Kurdish, but also the situation there has been very disappointing for many Kurds. Effectively, the two clans that dominate the two ruling parties in the Kurdish region of Iraq have, what many say, established kind of a duopoly of power and maintain the practices of corruption and all of that. And that Kurdish experiment in northern Iraq really hasn't been as successful as it should have been, but has rather become mired in corruption and many problems. The Kurds of northern Syria still have high hopes. Obviously, the US allied with the Kurds in Syria in order to fight ISIS. That was a successful alliance and a successful fight. The US remains in northeastern Syria partly because of its support and appreciation for the Kurds there. They did. And in their contacts with the Russians and with the Assad regime, they want to try to make sure that the Kurds get a good deal. That the Americans understand they're going to leave Syria at some point, but they want to make sure that the Kurds get something in terms of autonomy, in terms of some of their autonomous rights in the northeast. So far, the Assad regime has not been willing to do that, but we'll see how that goes. In Turkey, for many years, Erdogan was seen as quite a champion of the Kurdish issue and had very good relations and progress with the Kurds, even opened up negotiations with Öcalan, who was the imprisoned leader of the one of the more radical movements in the Kurdish movement. He was seen as somebody who could maybe solve the Kurdish question in Turkey. But several years ago, particularly after the Gulen or the coup that was attributed, or he accused the Gulens and others, he has turned completely to a much more Turkish nationalist position, very anti-Kurdish. And so things have gone bad for the Kurds there. The Kurds in Iran, like other minorities, are also kind of, I would say, suffering under a very centralized Islamist regime. Not much autonomy there. So sadly, no Kurdish nation state in the making, but maybe some better conditions, some autonomy here and there.
Thank you. I have one last question. This is coming from Jorge Araneda Tapia. He's a PhD candidate in Turkey, and his concern is with climate change and how climate change feeds intra-regional migrations, and it affects also food security, and he wants to know how this climate change that feeds intra-regional migration may affect or may impact foreign affairs. And he's got in mind, for example, the case of the governance of the Nile and the relationships between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan.
Yeah, excellent question. A number of things to say about that. I mean, the Nile dispute, you could say, is not exactly a climate change problem. Obviously, it's a Nile River problem. It becomes more of an acute problem because Egypt is suffering from more desertification, higher temperatures, less rainfall because of climate change. But effectively, it's a traditional sort of river basin dispute like we've seen throughout, some earlier periods of the 20th century. That remains a very acute crisis. You see now, aspects of a civil war in Ethiopia. To what degree has that been encouraged by players that are trying to put pressure on President Abiy and the Ethiopian government to be more lenient on the Renaissance Dam issue? He has been, I would say, not lenient. He has been pretty tough. That has upset the Egyptians, upset the Sudanese, and this remains a very serious problem. A member of MEI, of our Institute's Board of Trustees, Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman, is currently the U.S. envoy to the Horn of Africa and is in Ethiopia right now, I think, trying to deal with this issue and shuttling to Cairo and so on, but still no solution in sight. The more overall climate change problems are extremely serious throughout the Middle East. The Middle East is already the hottest region in the world. It's already the driest region in the world. It's already the most food insecure in the world. On top of that, it's also the most conflict-ridden and most number of IDPs and refugees of the world. So it starts in a bad situation. I must say that many of the governments of the region are now at least well aware of the problem and of the seriousness of it. The energy producing countries, I'm happy to say, are also moving quite impressively, I would say, to invest in, to be players in the new energy as well as the old energy. They are aware that hydrocarbons are going to continue to be used for the next 20, 30 years, no matter what happens, because the global economy is continuing to grow, and it's going to take a long time for alternative energies to completely be able to cover the energy needs of the world. So they're going to continue to sell oil and gas. They want to try to produce it in a slightly cleaner way, but they're also using some of that money to become leaders in solar energy, leaders in wind energy, and trying to position themselves as energy companies. And that's a good sign. The real crux of the matter, I would say, in protecting people from the extreme risks of climate change lies in governance. Obviously, climate change is coming. It's, now the question is, it's going to be 2 degrees, 1.5, 2.5. The Middle East is going to be hit more than others. So it's already here and it's going to come. In governments which are well capable, that have good planning, it is possible to prepare and to build resilience and to protect people from the oncoming impact of climate change, whether it's through food issues. There are ways to provide more food security. Food is now available globally. If you're a capable government, you can plan for that. If there are particular areas that are going to be flooded and you have a capable government, you can prepare for that. You can provide alternative housing and so on. The worrisome question in the Middle East more is to the areas where there is no governance. And that's a lot of places. That's all of Yemen. That's pretty much all of Syria, pretty much all of Lebanon, Iraq in bits and pieces, Libya. So climate change is going to kill people if there aren't governments in place to protect the people and to help them adjust and to compensate for the risks. So what I would say is to best prepare for climate change, end the civil wars, build up government capacity, and work with governments and with the international community to cushion, to prepare, to build resilience, to build capacity, so that as the temperatures rise, as water and rainfall patterns become erratic, that you have the capacity to provide food, provide housing for those communities that will be affected. It is possible, but it requires governance, planning, and resources.
Indeed, the region faces many challenges, and I think I talk for everyone when I say, we hope to see a more stable region with in overcoming many of these challenges that you were just mentioning. Having reached the time limit, I would like to give you the opportunity once again to address the audience and give some last thoughts, some comments, maybe a reflection that you want to share with us. And after that, we will just say goodbye.
Well, I want to, thank you and thank Professor Lados and thank everybody who joined us in this discussion. I wish I was there in person, and I wish we had more time. I would say that if I would wish for one among many other things, I would wish that there would be more interconnectivity, south-south interconnectivity between, I'm in Washington, D.C. in the north right now, but I've, lived all my life in Beirut, and you're in Cairo, and Jorge is in Istanbul. That South America and the countries of South America and Central America have gone through many of the challenges that the Middle East has. And maybe we can learn better from each other and learn what to do and learn what not to do, because we've also made mistakes. In particular, I'm very worried that the Middle East has really turned away from democracy and is consolidating an authoritarian form of government. Some of these governments are doing very well economically in terms of services. I'll give them credit. But at the end of the day, I believe in people's right to govern themselves, choose their own leaders. South America went through very dark periods of dictatorship and authoritarianism itself. Still has challenges, but has chosen a better path. And I wish more countries and people in the Middle East would learn from your example in that sense. But thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sullivan. Excellent presentation. Thank you for your masterful conducting the meeting. Excellent moderator. Thank you, the public, and I would like to let you know that I remember that this meeting has been recorded, so you can see it again in the YouTube channel of Fundación Foro del Sur. Thank you all for participating, and thank you for your excellent presentation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.